The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant Thomas Mitchell began his usual rounds. With 23 years of faithful service to the crown, Thomas had seen many secrets within these ancient walls, but nothing could have prepared him for what he would discover on this seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning. Thomas had always been meticulous about his duties. His colleagues often joked that he could spot a speck of dust from 50 yards away, but his attention to detail had earned him respect throughout the palace staff. Today felt different somehow, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. The air seemed heavier, charged with an energy that made the hair on his arms stand up. As he walked through the East Wing, Thomas noticed unusual activity near the private quarters. Staff members were moving more quickly than usual, their conversations hushed and urgent. Something was clearly amiss, but palace protocol demanded discretion above all else. Thomas continued his patrol, making mental notes of everything he observed. The first sign of trouble came when Thomas spotted a figure moving through the corridors at an unusual hour. Queen Consort Camilla was known for her predictable schedule, rarely deviating from her established routines. Yet here she was at 6:30 in the morning, carrying what appeared to be a small velvet bag and looking over her shoulder nervously. Thomas maintained his distance, following proper security protocol while keeping the Queen Consort in his line of sight. Years of training had taught him to observe without being obvious, and he employed every skill he possessed as he tracked her movements through the palace. Camilla made her way to a part of the palace that housed some of the crown's most precious historical artifacts. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. This area was strictly off-limits to all but the most senior members of the royal family, and even then, visits were carefully documented and supervised. What could possibly bring the Queen Consort here at such an early hour? And why was she being so secretive about it? The guard watched as Camilla produced a key from her coat pocket. Thomas recognized it immediately. It was one of only 3 keys that provided access to the Diana Memorial Collection, a private repository of the late princess's most cherished personal belongings. His mouth went dry as he realized the implications of what he was witnessing. Princess Diana's jewelry collection had been a source of fascination and controversy since her death. The pieces were not just valuable in monetary terms, they carried immense sentimental and historical significance. Each piece told a story of Diana's life, from her engagement ring that now graced Catherine's finger to the countless gifts from admirers around the world. The collection was meant to be preserved for future generations, a lasting tribute to the people's princess. Thomas positioned himself behind a marble pillar, ensuring he remained hidden while maintaining a clear view of Camilla's actions. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his phone, knowing that whatever he was about to witness could change everything. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him like a physical force. Camilla disappeared into the secure room, leaving Thomas alone with his racing thoughts. Minutes passed like hours as he waited, his mind spinning with possibilities. Perhaps there was an innocent explanation. Maybe she was simply checking on the collection or retrieving something for a memorial service. But the secrecy, the early hour, and her nervous behavior all pointed to something far more sinister. When Camilla emerged 20 minutes later, Thomas's worst fears were confirmed. The velvet bag she had been carrying was now noticeably fuller, and he could see the outline of several jewelry boxes pressing against the fabric. His training kicked in, and he began taking mental photographs of everything he observed, knowing that accuracy would be crucial in whatever came next. The Queen Consort's face was flushed, and her hands shook slightly as she locked the door behind her. Thomas had never seen her look so agitated, and the sight sent chills down his spine. This was not the composed, confident woman the public knew. This was someone consumed by guilt and fear. As Camilla hurried back through the corridors, Thomas faced the most difficult decision of his career. His loyalty to the crown was absolute, but what happened when members of the royal family themselves threatened that very institution? The oath he had taken years ago suddenly felt impossibly heavy. Thomas knew he had to act, but the consequences of his next actions would ripple through the monarchy and potentially destroy lives. Yet allowing theft of Diana's precious belongings to continue would be an even greater betrayal of everything he stood for. The guard made his choice. Moving with quiet determination, he began following Camilla once again, this time documenting her every move with his phone's camera. The images were grainy in the dim palace lighting, but they clearly showed the queen consort, moving through restricted areas with stolen goods. His heart hammered in his chest as he realized he was potentially capturing evidence that could bring down a member of the royal family. 23 years of loyal service had led to this moment, and Thomas knew there would be no going back once he crossed this line. Camilla's destination became clear as she approached the palace's east entrance, where a discreet black sedan waited in the shadows. Thomas recognized the driver immediately. It was Marcus Webb, a known dealer in high-end antiques and jewelry who operated in London's grey market. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with terrifying clarity. The exchange was swift and professional. Camilla handed over the velvet bag, and Marcus passed her an envelope that was clearly thick with cash. Thomas's camera captured it all, though his hands shook so badly he wasn't sure if the images would be clear enough to serve as evidence. As the sedan drove away into the early morning darkness, Camilla stood alone for a moment, staring at the envelope in her hands. Even from his hiding spot, Thomas could see the conflict written across her face. Whatever had driven her to this desperate act was clearly tearing her apart inside, but sympathy would have to wait. Thomas had witnessed a crime against the crown itself, and his duty was clear. As Camilla disappeared back into the palace, Thomas remained in the shadows, his phone in his hands and his mind racing with the implications of what he had just documented. The die had been cast and there would be no turning back. The weight of Thomas Mitchell's discovery pressed down on him like a mountain as he returned to his quarters. His small apartment within the palace staff wing had always been his sanctuary, a place where he could decompress after long days of maintaining palace security. Tonight, however, the familiar surroundings felt foreign and cold. Thomas sat on his narrow bed, staring at his phone screen where the images of Camilla's transaction glowed accusingly. Each photograph told a story of betrayal that went far deeper than simple theft. These weren't just valuable pieces of jewelry. They were sacred artifacts that belonged to the memory of Princess Diana, beloved by millions around the world. Sleep proved impossible. Thomas spent the dark hours pacing his small room, weighing his options. His first instinct was to report directly to his superior, Captain Harrison, but something held him back. The palace hierarchy was complex, and loyalty often trumped justice in these ancient halls. How could he be certain that his evidence wouldn't simply disappear, buried beneath layers of royal protection and institutional preservation? As dawn approached, Thomas made a decision that would change everything. Instead of following the normal chain of command, he would take his evidence directly to the highest authority he could access, the king's private secretary, Sir Edmund Worthington. It was a bold move that could cost him his career, but Thomas knew that some situations demanded extraordinary action. The morning brought renewed determination. Thomas waited until his shift officially began, then requested an urgent meeting with Sir Edmund. The private secretary's assistant, a stern woman named Mrs. Pemberton, initially dismissed his request with barely concealed disdain. Guards, in her view, were meant to be seen and not heard. Sir Edmund is preparing for the king's morning briefing, Mrs. Pemberton informed him coldly. Perhaps you could schedule something for next week. Thomas's resolve hardened. Tell Sir Edmund that it concerns the security of the crown jewels and cannot wait another minute. The magic words had their intended effect. Within 10 minutes, Thomas found himself standing in Sir Edmund's opulent office, surrounded by centuries of royal portraits and priceless artifacts. The irony was not lost on him that he was about to discuss stolen royal treasures while surrounded by so many others. Sir Edmund Worthington was a man in his 60s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He had served the royal family for over 30 years and was known throughout the palace for his unwavering discretion and loyalty. If anyone could handle this explosive situation properly, it would be him. Sergeant Mitchell, Sir Edmund began, his voice carrying the authority of decades in royal service. Mrs. Pemberton tells me you have urgent concerns about crown security. Please speak freely. Thomas took a deep breath and began his account. He described the morning's events in precise detail, from Camilla's suspicious behavior to the clandestine meeting with Marcus Webb. As he spoke, he watched Sir Edmund's face carefully, noting how the older man's expression shifted from polite interest to growing concern, and finally to barely controlled shock. When Thomas produced his phone and showed the photographs, Sir Edmund's composure finally cracked. The private secretary studied each image with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts, his face growing paler with each swipe. "My God," Sir Edmund whispered, sinking back into his leather chair. "Are you absolutely certain of what you witnessed, Sergeant?" "Completely certain, sir," Thomas replied firmly. "I've been documenting suspicious activity for weeks, though I never imagined it would lead to this." Sir Edmund's revelation that Thomas had been observing suspicious activity for weeks prompted him to reveal the fuller picture. For the past month, Thomas had noticed irregularities in the palace's security logs. Certain restricted areas were being accessed at unusual hours, always by someone with highest-level clearance. At first, he had assumed it was related to preparations for upcoming state functions, but the pattern was wrong. The thefts, Thomas explained, appeared to be carefully planned and executed over time. Small pieces would go missing from various collections, always items that might not be immediately missed. Diana's jewelry collection was vast, and individual pieces could disappear for weeks before their absence was noted during routine inventory checks. Thomas had been keeping his own unofficial log of these discrepancies, never imagining that they pointed to systematic theft by a member of the royal family itself. The evidence he had compiled painted a picture of careful, methodical pilfering that had been going on for months. Sir Edmund listened with growing horror as the full scope of the situation became clear. This wasn't a single moment of weakness or desperation. It was an ongoing criminal enterprise that threatened to destroy the monarchy's reputation and dishonor Diana's memory in the most public way possible. "Have you shared this information with anyone else?" Sir Edmund asked, his voice tight with controlled tension. "No one, sir. I came directly to you as soon as I was certain of what I had witnessed." Sir Edmund nodded approvingly. "You've shown remarkable judgment, Sergeant Mitchell. This situation requires the most delicate handling possible." The private secretary explained that accusations against senior royals couldn't be made lightly. The evidence would need to be absolutely bulletproof, and the handling of the situation would require careful coordination with multiple departments. The king himself would need to be informed, but only after they had gathered sufficient evidence to support their claims. "We need to catch her in the act again," Sir Edmund declared. One transaction could potentially be explained away or dismissed, but a pattern of behavior would be impossible to deny. Thomas agreed to continue his surveillance, this time with Sir Edmund's full authorization and support. They would work together to build an airtight case that could not be disputed or covered up. The stakes were enormous, not just for Camilla, but for the entire royal family and the institution of the monarchy itself. As their meeting concluded, Sir Edmund placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You've done your duty admirably, Sergeant. Whatever happens next, know that your loyalty to the crown will not be forgotten." Thomas left the meeting with a mixture of relief and apprehension. He had done the right thing by reporting his discoveries, but he also knew that he had set in motion events that could not be undone. The next few days would determine not just Camilla's fate, but potentially the future of the monarchy itself. That evening, as Thomas resumed his regular duties, he noticed that Camilla seemed agitated and distracted during her public appearances. She stumbled over words during a charity luncheon and appeared to be avoiding eye contact with staff members. Either guilt was eating away at her, or she was planning her next move. Thomas prepared himself for whatever would come next, knowing that his vigilance in the coming days could make the difference between justice and cover-up. The game had changed, and now he was no longer just a witness. He was an active participant in protecting the crown from one of its own. The next 3 days passed in a haze of tension and careful observation. Thomas Mitchell found himself living a double life, maintaining his regular duties while secretly conducting the most important surveillance operation of his career. Every moment felt charged with significance. Every glance from palace staff seemed to carry hidden meaning. Sir Edmund had provided Thomas with sophisticated recording equipment, carefully concealed within his standard security gear. The private secretary had also arranged for additional support, though Thomas wouldn't know who else was involved until it became necessary. The secrecy was essential. One leak could destroy everything they had worked to build. Camilla's behavior over those 3 days only confirmed Thomas's suspicions. She appeared increasingly nervous during public engagements, often checking her phone obsessively and excusing herself from events earlier than scheduled. Palace staff whispered among themselves about the queen consort's apparent distraction, but none could have guessed the true cause of her anxiety. On Thursday evening, Thomas intercepted a coded message that made his blood run cold. Hidden within routine palace communications was a carefully disguised appointment. Camilla would be meeting with Marcus Webb again, this time at a discreet location outside the palace grounds. The meeting was scheduled for Friday night after the completion of all official royal duties. Sir Edmund's response to this intelligence was swift and decisive. "This is our opportunity," he told Thomas during a hastily arranged meeting in his private study. "We'll have multiple recording devices in place, and law enforcement will be standing by at a discreet distance. There will be no possibility of denial or cover-up this time." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Thomas would follow Camilla to the meeting location, maintaining visual contact while staying far enough away to avoid detection. Undercover police officers would be positioned around the area, and the entire transaction would be recorded from multiple angles. Sir Edmund himself would be monitoring everything from a mobile command center. Friday dawned gray and overcast, matching Thomas's mood perfectly. The weight of what was about to unfold pressed down on him as he went through the motions of his regular duties. Colleagues commented that he seemed distracted, but Thomas brushed off their concerns with vague mentions of personal matters. As evening approached, Thomas positioned himself near the east entrance where he had first witnessed Camilla's criminal activity. The familiar velvet bag was once again in her possession, and her nervous energy was palpable even from a distance. This time, however, Thomas was prepared. The meeting location turned out to be a high-end restaurant in Mayfair, the kind of establishment where wealthy clients conducted business deals over expensive wine and imported delicacies. Camilla arrived first, taking a corner table that afforded privacy, while still maintaining an air of legitimacy. To any casual observer, she appeared to be simply waiting for a dinner companion. Marcus Webb arrived precisely on schedule, his appearance carefully calculated to blend in with the restaurant's wealthy clientele. Thomas watched from across the street as the two figures greeted each other, with the casual familiarity of established business partners. The sight made his stomach turn. This clearly wasn't their first clandestine meeting. The exchange itself was more sophisticated than their previous encounter. Instead of a crude handoff in a palace parking area, they conducted their business with the polish of experienced criminals. Camilla discreetly passed a small package across the table, which Marcus examined briefly before nodding his approval. The envelope that changed hands in return was thicker than before, suggesting that tonight's haul was particularly valuable. Thomas's recording equipment captured every detail, from Camilla's nervous glances around the restaurant to Marcus's satisfied smile as he counted the contents of the package. The audio was crystal clear, picking up fragments of their conversation that would prove devastating when played back in an official setting. "The sapphire set should fetch at least double what we got for the emeralds," Marcus was heard saying. "My buyers in Dubai are particularly interested in pieces with royal provenance." Camilla's response was barely audible, but the recording equipment picked up every word. "Just make sure there's no way to trace them back to me. If this gets out, it will destroy everything." The implications of those words hit Thomas like a physical blow. This wasn't desperation or a single moment of weakness. It was calculated theft, motivated by greed and executed with careful planning. The woman who had married into the royal family was systematically looting the most precious artifacts of her predecessors. As the meeting concluded, Thomas felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. The evidence they had gathered would be impossible to refute, but it would also create a scandal that would rock the monarchy to its very foundations. Diana's memory would be avenged, but at a cost that would be felt for generations. Sir Edmund's voice crackled through Thomas's hidden earpiece. "Excellent work, Sergeant. We have everything we need. Maintain surveillance until she returns to the palace, then report to my office immediately." The ride back to Buckingham Palace felt surreal. Thomas followed Camilla's car through London's evening traffic, watching as she maintained the facade of royal dignity, even while sitting on evidence of her own criminality. She waved to a few pedestrians who recognized her, her smile perfect and practiced, betraying nothing of the darkness beneath. Back at the palace, Camilla disappeared into her private quarters as if nothing had happened. Thomas, meanwhile, made his way to Sir Edmund's office, where the full scope of their success was becoming clear. The private secretary had been monitoring multiple audio and video feeds, and the evidence was overwhelming in both quantity and quality. "The king must be informed immediately," Sir Edmund declared, his face grim with the weight of what they had uncovered. "This cannot wait until morning." Thomas realized that his role in this drama was far from over. As the primary witness and the person who had first detected the criminal activity, he would likely be called upon to testify and provide evidence in whatever proceedings followed. The thought was both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because of the magnitude of the scandal he was about to unleash, but liberating because justice would finally be served. The night was far from over. Within hours, the evidence would be presented to the king himself, and decisions would be made that would reshape the royal family forever. Thomas had done his duty, protecting the crown from those who would betray it from within, but the consequences of that duty were only beginning to unfold. As he prepared for what would certainly be the most important meeting of his life, Thomas reflected on the strange turns that had brought him to this moment. 23 years of faithful service had led to this single night when everything changed. Tomorrow the world would be different and there would be no going back for any of them. The emergency meeting was scheduled for midnight in the king's private study, a room that had witnessed some of the most crucial decisions in modern royal history. Thomas Mitchell found himself walking through corridors he had never seen before, escorted by Sir Edmund through passages that existed beyond the public areas of Buckingham Palace. The weight of the evidence in his briefcase felt heavier with each step. King Charles had been informed of the general nature of the emergency, but the specific details had been withheld until this moment. Sir Edmund believed that such devastating news should be delivered in person, with all evidence present and no possibility of misunderstanding. The private secretary's face was drawn with exhaustion and stress as they approached the king's private quarters. The study itself was surprisingly intimate, filled with personal photographs, books, and artifacts that spoke to the king's private interests rather than his public role. Thomas had expected something more formal, more intimidating, but instead found himself in what felt like an elderly gentleman's comfortable den. The contrast between the setting and the explosive nature of their evidence was jarring. King Charles entered wearing a simple robe over his pajamas, his gray hair disheveled and his expression showing both concern and irritation at being awakened. At 75, he moved with the careful dignity of someone who had learned to maintain composure, even in the most trying circumstances. However, nothing in his long preparation for kingship could have prepared him for what he was about to hear. "Sir Edmund," the king began, settling into his favorite armchair, "your message suggested this was a matter of utmost urgency. I trust you wouldn't disturb me at this hour without exceptional cause." Sir Edmund stepped forward, his hands clasped behind his back in the formal posture he had maintained for decades of royal service. "Your Majesty, Sergeant Mitchell has uncovered evidence of theft from the royal collections, specifically from Princess Diana's memorial collection." The king's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained controlled. "Theft? Surely this is a matter for palace security and the police. Why does it require my immediate attention?" Thomas watched as Sir Edmund took a deep breath, preparing to deliver the blow that would shatter the king's world. "Because, Your Majesty, the evidence indicates that Queen Consort Camilla is responsible for the theft." The silence that followed was deafening. King Charles sat motionless for what felt like an eternity, his face cycling through emotions too complex for Thomas to read. Disbelief, shock, anger, and something that might have been resignation all flickered across his features before settling into a mask of royal composure. "Show me," the king said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to age him years in moments. Thomas stepped forward and opened his briefcase with trembling hands. The photographs, audio recordings, and documentation that had taken days to compile now felt inadequate to the task of destroying a marriage and potentially a monarchy. Yet the evidence spoke for itself with devastating clarity. As Thomas narrated each piece of evidence, the king's composure began to crack. The first photograph of Camilla accessing the secure collection brought a sharp intake of breath. The recording of her conversation with Marcus Webb caused his hands to tremble visibly. By the time Thomas reached the video of the restaurant exchange, tears were streaming down the monarch's cheeks. "How long?" the king asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How long has this been going on?" Thomas consulted his notes, though the numbers were burned into his memory. "Based on inventory discrepancies and security irregularities, I believe the systematic theft has been occurring for at least 6 months, possibly longer. Conservative estimates suggest that items worth several £1,000,000 have already been sold. The financial loss, however, paled in comparison to the emotional devastation. King Charles had built his second marriage carefully, overcoming public skepticism and media criticism, to find happiness with Camilla after decades of separation. The revelation that his wife had been systematically stealing from his first wife's memorial collection was a betrayal that cut to the very core of his being. "Diana's sapphire and diamond parure," the king said suddenly, looking up with sudden understanding. "It's been missing for months. Camilla told me it had been sent for cleaning and restoration." Sir Edmund nodded grimly. "According to our investigation, that piece was among the first items sold. Marcus Webb's records indicate it went to a private collector in Geneva for approximately £2 million. The king aged another decade in that moment. The parure had been one of Diana's favorite sets, worn during some of her most memorable public appearances. Its loss represented not just theft, but the erasure of irreplaceable history. Thomas watched as the king struggled with the implications of what he had learned. This wasn't just a criminal matter. It was a constitutional crisis that threatened the stability of the monarchy itself. If news of Camilla's theft became public, the scandal would dwarf any previous royal controversy. "What do you recommend?" the king asked, his voice hollow with exhaustion and grief. Sir Edmund had clearly been preparing for this question. "Your Majesty, we have several options, each with significant consequences. We could pursue criminal charges through normal channels, but that would inevitably become public and create a media firestorm. Alternatively, we could handle this as an internal matter, but that carries risks of cover-up accusations if the truth eventually emerges." The king stood and walked to the window, staring out at the palace gardens where he had spent so many peaceful hours with Camilla. The irony was bitter. The woman who had brought him such personal happiness had also delivered the most devastating blow of his reign. "There is a third option," Sir Edmund continued carefully. "Immediate separation and banishment from all royal residences and duties, with the understanding that criminal charges could still be filed if the stolen items are not recovered." Thomas held his breath as he watched the king consider this option. Banishment would be immediate and final, but it might allow the monarchy to control the narrative and minimize damage. It would also send a clear message that theft from royal collections would not be tolerated, regardless of the perpetrator's position. "And if she refuses to comply?" the king asked. "Then we proceed with criminal charges and let the consequences fall where they may," Sir Edmund replied. "The evidence Sergeant Mitchell has gathered is absolutely conclusive. There would be no possibility of acquittal." The king returned to his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 75 years. The weight of decision pressed down on him as he contemplated options that would reshape his life and his reign. Personal happiness had to be weighed against duty to the crown and justice for Diana's memory. "Arrange a private meeting with Camilla for tomorrow morning," the king decided finally. "She will be given the opportunity to confess and make restitution, or face the full consequences of her actions. Either way, she will no longer be welcome in any royal residence." Thomas felt a mixture of relief and sadness as he watched the king make this painful decision. Justice would be served, but at a cost that would haunt everyone involved for years to come. The meeting concluded with arrangements for confronting Camilla the following morning. Thomas would be present as the primary witness, while Sir Edmund would handle the legal and practical aspects of her banishment. The king would face his wife with evidence of her betrayal and deliver an ultimatum that would change everything forever. The morning of reckoning arrived with deceptive calm. Buckingham Palace hummed with its usual activity as staff prepared for another day of royal duties, completely unaware that their world was about to be shaken to its foundations. Thomas Mitchell had barely slept, spending the dark hours rehearsing his testimony and preparing for what would surely be the most difficult confrontation of his career. At precisely 10 o'clock, Camilla entered the king's private study with her usual grace and confidence. She was impeccably dressed in a navy blue suit, her hair perfectly styled and her makeup flawless. Nothing in her demeanor suggested she had any inkling of what awaited her. The contrast between her composed exterior and the devastating evidence that would soon be revealed was almost unbearable to witness. "Good morning, darling," she said to the king, leaning in for their customary kiss. Charles accepted the gesture mechanically, his face betraying nothing of the turmoil beneath. "Sir Edmund Sergeant Mitchell," she acknowledged with polite nods, though Thomas caught a flicker of confusion in her eyes at his unexpected presence. The king gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Please sit, Camilla. We have some very serious matters to discuss." Something in his tone must have alerted her to danger, because her confident smile faltered slightly as she took her seat. Her eyes darted between the three men, clearly trying to understand why a palace guard was present at what she had assumed would be a routine morning briefing. Sir Edmund stepped forward, his expression grave. "Your Majesty, with your permission, I believe we should present the evidence immediately." Camilla's face went pale. "Evidence? What evidence? What is this about?" King Charles leaned back in his chair, studying his wife with the detached air of a judge rather than a husband. "It's about theft, Camilla. Specifically, the systematic theft of items from Princess Diana's memorial collection." The words hit Camilla like physical blows. Thomas watched as her carefully maintained composure crumbled in real time. Her hands began to shake, and she gripped the arms of her chair so tightly that her knuckles went white. "I don't know what you're talking about," she managed to say, but her voice lacked conviction. The guilt was written across her face in unmistakable terms. Thomas stepped forward and began presenting the evidence methodically. The photographs of her accessing restricted areas, the security footage showing her removing items, the recordings of her conversations with Marcus Webb. Each piece of evidence fell like a hammer blow, systematically destroying any possibility of denial. As the audio recording of her restaurant conversation played through the room's speakers, Camilla seemed to shrink into herself. Her earlier defiance gave way to something approaching despair as her own words condemned her beyond any possibility of excuse or explanation. "The sapphire set should fetch at least double what we got for the emeralds," her recorded voice said clearly. "My buyers in Dubai are particularly interested in pieces with royal provenance." When the recording ended, the silence in the room was oppressive. Camilla sat with her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking with what might have been sobs or laughter. Thomas couldn't tell which. "How could you?" King Charles asked, his voice breaking with emotion. "Diana's jewelry? Her memory? How could you violate something so sacred?" Camilla looked up, and Thomas was shocked by the change in her appearance. In the space of 30 minutes, she had transformed from a confident queen consort into a broken woman whose world was collapsing around her. "The debts," she whispered, barely audible. "The gambling debts. They threatened to expose everything, to destroy the monarchy's reputation. I thought I could sell a few pieces, pay them off, and no one would ever know." The admission hit the room like a thunderbolt. Thomas had suspected greed as the motive, but gambling addiction added a layer of tragedy to the betrayal that made it somehow even worse. King Charles stared at his wife in horror. "Gambling debts? How much do you owe?" £15 million, Camilla replied, her voice hollow with despair. "Maybe more by now. The interest keeps growing, and they said they would go to the press if I didn't pay. Can you imagine the scandal? The monarchy couldn't survive it." Sir Edmund exchanged glances with Thomas. This revelation changed everything. Camilla's theft, while inexcusable, was apparently motivated by a misguided attempt to protect the royal family from an even greater scandal. The irony was devastating. In trying to save the monarchy from embarrassment, she had committed an act that could destroy it entirely. "So you decided to steal from Diana's collection instead," the king said, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. "You thought that was the better choice?" Camilla broke down completely then, tears streaming down her face as years of guilt and fear finally found release. "I never meant for it to go so far. It started with just one piece, a small brooch that I thought wouldn't be missed. But the debts kept growing, and the threats kept coming, and I couldn't stop." Thomas found himself feeling an unexpected wave of sympathy for the woman he had been investigating. Her crime was unforgivable, but the desperation that drove her was painfully human. She had made terrible choices, but they had been born from fear rather than pure greed. The king stood and walked to his window, staring out at the gardens as he processed this new information. The woman he had loved and married was not the calculating criminal they had imagined, but a desperate addict who had lost control of her life and made choices that destroyed everything she claimed to love. The stolen items must be recovered immediately, Sir Edmund stated firmly. Every single piece must be returned to the royal collection regardless of the cost. Camilla nodded frantically. I can contact Marcus. Some pieces haven't been sold yet. Others might be bought back, though it will cost much more than I received for them. That's not your concern anymore, the king said without turning from the window. You will provide a complete list of everything you stole, everyone you worked with, and every buyer who purchased items. The royal family will handle the recovery regardless of expense. The financial cost would be enormous, but Thomas understood that money was the least of their concerns. The real question was whether the monarchy could survive the scandal if Camilla's crimes became public knowledge. King Charles finally turned back to face his wife, his expression a mixture of love, disappointment, and resolve. Camilla, you have betrayed not just me, but the memory of Diana and the trust of the British people. There can be no forgiveness for this. The words fell like a death sentence. Camilla looked up at her husband with pleading eyes but found no mercy there. The king had made his decision and it was final. You will leave Buckingham Palace immediately, he continued. All royal duties are suspended indefinitely. You are banned from all royal residences and functions. If you cooperate fully in recovering the stolen items, we will handle this as a private family matter. If you do not cooperate, criminal charges will be filed within 24 hours. The ultimatum was delivered with the cold precision of a military order. There would be no negotiation, no appeal, and no second chances. Camilla's fate had been sealed by her own actions, and the consequences would be swift and absolute. Camilla began to sob uncontrollably, the reality of her situation finally sinking in completely. Her marriage was over, her position destroyed, and her future uncertain. The gambling addiction that had driven her to such desperate measures had ultimately cost her everything she had worked to achieve. Charles, please, she begged through her tears. I know I've done terrible things, but surely we can work through this together. I can get help for the gambling, make amends somehow. Don't throw away everything we've built together. The king's expression softened slightly, revealing the pain beneath his anger. You threw it away the moment you decided to steal from Diana's collection. Some betrayals cannot be forgiven, Camilla. This is one of them. Sir Edmund stepped forward with a thick folder of documents. These are the legal papers for your immediate separation from all royal duties and your banishment from royal properties. You have 1 hour to pack your personal belongings and leave the palace. A car will be waiting to take you wherever you wish to go. Thomas watched as Camilla signed the documents with shaking hands, each signature marking the end of her royal life. The woman who had fought for decades to win public acceptance as part of the royal family was now being cast out in disgrace, her reputation destroyed by her own actions. As the meeting concluded, Thomas realized that his role in this drama was far from over. He would need to work with law enforcement to track down the stolen items and ensure their return. The investigation would likely continue for months as they traced the full extent of the theft network that Camilla had created. The king dismissed Thomas and Sir Edmund, asking for time alone with his wife for their final conversation as husband and wife. As they left the study, Thomas could hear Camilla's voice rising in desperate pleas, but the king's responses were too quiet to make out. An hour later, Thomas watched from an upper window as Camilla emerged from the palace for the final time. She carried only a single suitcase, her face hidden behind dark sunglasses. The confident queen consort who had entered the palace that morning was gone forever, replaced by a broken woman whose own choices had destroyed her life. The black sedan that carried her 6 months after Camilla's banishment from Buckingham Palace, the full scope of her betrayal had finally been revealed. Thomas Mitchell stood in the restored Diana Memorial Collection room, watching as the final recovered pieces were carefully returned to their rightful places. The investigation had been exhaustive, spanning 3 continents and involving law enforcement agencies from London to Dubai. The recovery operation had cost the royal family an estimated £25 million, nearly double what Camilla had received for the stolen items. Some pieces had been sold multiple times, with each transaction driving up the cost of recovery. Others had disappeared into private collections owned by individuals who had no intention of returning them regardless of their provenance. Marcus Webb, the antiques dealer who had served as Camilla's primary fence, had been arrested and charged with handling stolen goods. His cooperation with authorities had been essential in tracking down many of the missing pieces, though he faced a lengthy prison sentence regardless. The network of buyers and sellers that had grown around Camilla's theft had been extensive, involving corrupt dealers, unscrupulous collectors, and shadowy middlemen operating in the gray areas of international art commerce. Thomas had been promoted to Chief of Palace Security, a position that recognized both his exceptional detective work and his unwavering loyalty to the crown. The promotion came with significant responsibilities, including oversight of all security protocols for royal collections and the implementation of new systems designed to prevent similar thefts in the future. The king had aged visibly in the months following Camilla's banishment. The betrayal had cut deep, destroying not only his marriage but also his faith in those closest to him. He had thrown himself into his royal duties with renewed intensity, as if trying to atone for the damage his wife had caused to the institution he had sworn to protect. Public speculation about Camilla's disappearance from royal duties had been intense but carefully managed. The official story spoke of health concerns and a need for privacy, which allowed the royal family to maintain dignity while keeping the true scandal from public view. Only a handful of senior palace officials knew the real reason for her absence, and all had sworn themselves to absolute secrecy. Camilla herself had disappeared from public view entirely. Thomas had heard rumors that she was living in a small cottage in Scotland, supported by a modest allowance that ensured her silence but offered no luxury. Her gambling addiction was reportedly being treated at a private clinic, though whether she would ever truly recover from the compulsions that had driven her to such desperate acts remained unclear. The psychological impact of the scandal extended far beyond the immediate participants. Princess William and Catherine had been privately briefed on the situation, their shock and disgust evident even through their careful royal composure. The thought that someone had been systematically stealing from Diana's memorial collection while publicly presenting herself as a loving stepmother was almost too horrible to comprehend. Thomas often found himself thinking about the deeper implications of what he had uncovered. The theft had not been motivated by simple greed, but by addiction and desperation. Camilla's gambling problem had been hidden so well that even her husband had been unaware of its severity. The revelation raised troubling questions about privacy, support systems, and the pressures faced by those in the highest levels of royal life. The new security measures Thomas had implemented were revolutionary in their scope and sophistication. Every item in every royal collection was now tagged with microscopic tracking devices. Access to restricted areas required biometric verification and was monitored in real time by artificial intelligence systems capable of detecting unusual behavior patterns. The days when someone could simply walk into a secure room with a key and steal priceless artifacts were over forever. Yet Thomas knew that the most important security measures were not technological, but human. The network of trust and mutual accountability that had failed so catastrophically in Camilla's case needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. Staff members were now required to report any suspicious behavior they observed, and regular psychological evaluations were conducted for anyone with access to valuable collections. The king had personally asked Thomas to oversee the creation of a new memorial to Princess Diana, one that would showcase her jewelry collection in a setting that honored her memory while protecting it from future theft. The memorial would be open to the public on certain days each year, allowing Diana's admirers to see the treasures that had been so nearly lost forever. As Thomas walked through the memorial room, he paused at the display case containing Diana's sapphire and diamond parure. The piece had been among the most difficult to recover, requiring delicate negotiations with a Swiss collector who had paid nearly £4 million for it. Looking at it now, perfectly restored and protected behind bulletproof glass, Thomas felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The case also contained a small placard that few visitors would likely notice, acknowledging the diligent work of palace security staff in preserving these treasures for future generations. It was the closest thing to public recognition that Thomas would ever receive for his role in exposing the scandal. But it was enough. He had not acted for glory or recognition, but out of duty to the crown and respect for Diana's memory. The investigation had also revealed troubling gaps in financial oversight within the royal household. Camilla's gambling debts had accumulated over several years without detection, suggesting that the systems designed to monitor royal finances were inadequate. New protocols had been implemented requiring regular financial audits and mandatory reporting of any debts exceeding certain thresholds. Thomas reflected on the human cost of the entire affair as he completed his evening rounds. The king remained unmarried and showed no interest in finding companionship. The betrayal had wounded him so deeply that he seemed to have closed his heart to the possibility of personal happiness. The crown had been protected, but at the cost of the monarch's emotional well-being. The scandal had also strengthened certain aspects of the monarchy in unexpected ways. The swift and decisive response to Camilla's theft had demonstrated that the royal family would not tolerate corruption or betrayal, even from their own members. This zero-tolerance approach had enhanced public trust and reinforced the institution's commitment to integrity. As Thomas locked the memorial room for the night, he felt the weight of history surrounding him. The artifacts he protected were more than mere jewelry. They were tangible links to one of the most beloved figures in modern royal history. His vigilance had preserved not just their monetary value, but their symbolic importance to millions of people around the world who continued to mourn Diana's loss. The future stretched ahead with new challenges and responsibilities, but Thomas faced them with confidence born of experience. He had proven himself capable of making the most difficult decisions when duty demanded it, and he knew that the crown was safer for his service. The oath he had taken decades ago continued to guide him, and he remained ready to protect the monarchy from any threat, whether external or internal. In the quiet corridors of Buckingham Palace, where centuries of secrets had been kept and revealed, Thomas Mitchell continued his eternal watch. The guard who had once been invisible had become the guardian of royal treasures and royal honor, ensuring that the crown would endure for future generations undiminished by the betrayals of the past.